Hello, and welcome to the Original Rushman Show. On this show, we will be taking an historical look into the mystical, magical, musical world of Rush, highlighting the career of Rush as seen through the eyes of a Rush fan of over 45 years. So join me on this journey by subscribing below, and maybe you can discover the Rush that I know. All right, thanks for joining me for episode number 25 of the Original Rushman Show. They tried to cancel the band Rush with this article from 1978. Rush was a band that did just about everything differently than all other bands. From the way they wrote their music, to the way they performed their music live, to the subject matter inside that music. And as a result, they were an easy target. As a kid, I remember going through every music magazine I could find, opening up and perusing through the index to see if there was any article about Rush, because I wanted to find out as much as I could about my favorite band. And if I found one, I usually read it right there in the store, because the articles were more often than not negative. And I wasn't going to pay for that. The media had a disdain for Rush that I just didn't understand. But now, I think I know why. They were trying to cancel the band Rush. In England, 1978, at the Hammersmith Odeon, the music reviewer for the New Musical Express named Barry Miles got the job of interviewing Rush after the concert. This infamous March 4th, 1978 article that followed described Rush in a very unfavorable light. Barry Miles' concert review and profile of Rush turned into a malicious attack, starting with the headline that read, "Is everybody feeling all right?" with GEDDIT, get it, in parentheses. The gist of this being that heavy metal tourist Rush are all righter than most, as Miles discovers. That is the headline of the article we're about to discuss. I found this article from Rock's Back Pages. It must have been released somewhere around Wednesday, May 13th, 2015, as Rush kick off their R40 Live 40th Anniversary Tour. Rock's Back Pages takes a trip back to March 4th, 1978, where Miles, writing for New Musical Express, questions the band's supposed proto-fascism. Barry Miles starts off his article with a quote from Ayn Rand, I guess to expose how ridiculous she is. "And here over the portals of my fort I shall cut in the stone the word which is my beacon and my banner, the word which will not die, should we all perish in battle, the word which can never die on this earth, for it's the heart of it and the meaning and the glory, the sacred word ego." Closing passage from Ayn Rand's Anthem. The most ironic thing about that quote is it's Barry Miles and his ego that wouldn't allow him to listen to what Rush was trying to say, to give any credence to what Rush was trying to say, to admit in any way, shape, or form that he could possibly be wrong. But ego is a bad thing. He starts off by saying, "I got the job of interviewing Rush because I was the only one on NME who knew who Ayn Rand was. Simple as that." Well, I don't believe that, because Ayn Rand was to the socialists as Saul Alinsky was to the capitalists. Everybody knew who Ayn Rand was in 1978. But he goes on to say she's an obscure, ultra right wing American cult writer of the late 30s and early 40s. And yes, Rush follow her ideas. The Epic 2112 is a rewrite of her book Anthem, and they also named their Canadian record label after the same book. He says that I did a crash course on Rush, played their albums, probably so, read some interviews, reread a couple of Ayn Rand's books. I call BS on that because you don't just reread a couple of Ayn Rand's books. Have you ever seen an Ayn Rand book? It's about this thick. Must have took her 10 years to write each one of them. I think she only wrote 3. So you don't just reread a couple of Ayn Rand's books. Then he starts off by saying, I didn't think the concert was quite as bad as last week's NME review. In other words, he torched them and destroyed them and said they were probably the worst band he'd ever seen in his entire life. And he says, I mean, they're just a power trio in the grand tradition of Cream, Nice, and Blue Cheer, updated into the later 70s with voice echoes, fold-back EQ, phasing on the drums, and a very sophisticated lighting system. Nothing to worry about. The interview starts off normal. Neil talks about how hard rock is our kind of music, the music we grew up on. It's what comes naturally to us. We just look at it as something that we're trying to keep contemporary. We're not trying to play the music of the late 60s. We're trying to play the music of the late 70s, which has grown out of the 60s. He says we're trying to take a modern approach in the same way the Beatles took a modern approach to Chuck Berry, and so on. For us, the people we followed were Jeff Beck, The Who, Cream, Hendrix, mainly British bands. And then he goes on, inserts into the article part of his critique of the concert. He says, vocalist Geddy Lee has an interesting voice, very high-pitched and not unlike David Surkamp of Pavlov's Dog. I don't know. Anybody know who that is? Never heard of Pavlov's Dog or David Surkamp. He says at dynamic peaks in the music, he breaks into a high castrati, shrieks and yelps like a throttled blackbird clamped to the PA. Now that's not very creative in my opinion. I prefer like a cat with his tail caught underneath the rocking chair myself, but whatever. And then he says Alex Lifeson is a reasonable guitarist of his genre. I've been to too many Hendrix, Cream, and Zappa concerts to say better than that. And then he talks about Neil Peart in his big old double bass drum kit, a la Keith Moon, and ends up saying that on the night I saw him, I thought his timing was defective. Yeah, I doubt very seriously he can determine whether or not Neil Peart's timings were defective. After the concert, apparently it wasn't a perfect concert, and Neil was a little bit depressed because it wasn't a perfect show. And they talked about their American tour and that this was the 120th concert of this current tour. And Neil continues talking about the extremely elusive perfect show. He said, I would say that out of all those shows, there were only 3 that I would consider as the standard, as the ideal show. So I got to figure that all those other 117 were substandard. Well, I don't mean they were substandard, but they were below the perfect level. Geddy said we don't expect the audience to know what that standard is. It's purely a personal measure against past performances. Because this brought up the matter of their attitude towards their audiences. At Hammersmith, the audience was the usual heavy metal crowd pretending to play the guitar and giving power salutes at the end of each number. Rush didn't seem to take any notice of them despite their obvious enthusiasm, if not fanaticism. He says, it seemed as though Rush's performance existed as closed-off totality of its own, quite separate from anything the audience might do, and could have performed the same just as easily anywhere on the planet. It wasn't a two-way thing at all. Neil agrees and seems surprised that I should think that this was a bad thing. I said that I thought of a performance as an interaction with the audience. Getty answered, from their perspective, it is, but not from ours. We just have a goal to achieve and a certain standard to get to. And if you don't get that, no matter how wonderful the audience was to you, you still know it when you come off the stage. Neil says they just want to put on the best show they possibly can, and they're so imbued in their music and their performance that you're seeing, I guess, just a level of professionalism. That, are you talking about telling jokes to the audience or telling them when our birthday is? He says, it just seemed to me that with the Stones or Zappa, who are also very professional, that the individual personalities come across, whereas Rush behaves as one. Alex says that's always been our goal. The whole point of being in a band is to be one unit. You know, this guy doesn't want Rush to spew their ideas to the people, but he complains that they're not spewing their ideas to the people. Neil says, we don't want to be Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. That type of thing wasn't what we were after. It was most important for each of us to be equal in input and output. Each of us has to pull the same amount. He said, with all those discussions with individuals, it was inevitable. He pre-planned this. No doubt it was coming up sooner or later. But he says it was inevitable that the conversation should turn to Ayn Rand, high priestess of the ultra-right Reds Under the Bed Brigade. It seemed very odd to me that a 70s rock group should dig up a Cold War hero and warm her up. Neil says she's a very brilliant woman, an excellent writer, but a brilliant thinker as well. She has a great clarity of thought. And Getty says, I think she's brought forth a lot of concepts and philosophies that have confirmed for us a lot of different things. I've just found it very positive. I found a lot of truth in what she writes. And then he makes his own personal commentary, says, Ayn Rand's philosophy in her own words is that to be free, a man must be free of his brothers. That is freedom. That and nothing else. And he said, well, this is where he makes his own personal comment. He said, in other words, the exact opposite to Christian charity and the whole European humanist tradition. In fact, she regards altruism as incompatible with man's nature, with the requirements of his survival, and with a free society. You know, you don't have to agree with everything everybody says. You may agree with 50% of what somebody says. You take what you can take to improve your life and throw everything else out. He says, Ayn Rand is naturally, fanatically anti-communist. Well, yeah. Isn't everybody who lives in a free society anti-communist? Her books are dedicated to helping to prevent a socialist America and are filled with constant attacks on the evils of collectivism. I think everybody should read Ayn Rand's books if it will help us prevent socialism in America. Anyway, he says, by this, she means such communist horrors as free medical care. No such thing as free medical care. Doctors have to get paid by somebody. Free schooling, unemployment benefits, sick pay, etc. It's like all or nothing with this guy. It's either 100% socialism or 100% capitalism. Anyway, Under the system of laissez-faire capitalism, she advocates it would be a return to a total free-for-all with no controls at all on employers and with no welfare state at all. It is a system long ago regarded as absolutely unworkable, even by such well-known communists as David Rockefeller. But there are still a few extremists left on the far right in the States. And surprisingly enough, Rush sided with them. Our conversation went like this. Okay, so at this point, Neil Peart thinks the interview is over with, and that they're just sitting around shooting the shit. Okay, and so when Neil Peart read this article about a year later, he was flabbergasted. He felt betrayed because he thought he didn't know this was part of the interview, and the guy was still rolling tape. Anyway, Neil said, "We're certainly devoted to individualism as the only concept that allows men to be happy without somebody taking from somebody else. The thing for me about Ayn Rand is that her philosophy is the only one applicable to the world today in every sense. If you take her ideas, then take them farther in your own mind, you can find answers to pretty well everything on an individual basis. Putting the individual as the first priority, everything can be made to work in a way that it can never be made to work under any other system." He said, "I began to object to this statement, but Neil interrupted me excitedly. You're living in the best example. Look at Britain and what socialism has done to Britain. It's crippling. And what it's done to the youth. What do you think the Sex Pistols and all the rest of them are really frustrated about? They're frustrated because they're growing up in a socialist society in which there's no place for them as individuals. They either join the morass or they fight it with the only means left. They have literally no future. I lived here, and I lived and worked here, and I know what it feels like, and it's not very nice." And he says, "Do you really think they're a product of socialism?" Well, yeah. What else? What else are they fighting against if they're not fighting that? And then he goes, "Fighting against socialism." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And they talk about England, and then he says, "So now I understood the freedom he was talking about. Freedom for employers and those with money to do what they like, and freedom for the workers to quit and starve or not. Work makes free. Didn't I remember that idea from somewhere? Work makes free. Oh, yes. It was written over the main gateway to Auschwitz concentration camp, where Getty's mother and father as teenagers were kept, and Alex's mother and father as teenagers were kept." Oh, man, oh, man, oh, man. He talked about trade unions and stuff like that. And he says, "I had to ask the obvious. If it was true freedom for workers at a factory to be bargain with the boss, why wouldn't they be even more free if they did away with him altogether and simply ran the place themselves as workers council? After all, they do all the work." Neil said, "Because then your freedom is negated. You have no freedom. You do what you're told to do by the socialists, by the good of the people." Well, he says, I didn't want to get into an argument about ownership of the means of production being a different matter from personal property, particularly since I'd had to wait some time at the Holiday Inn bar before Rush could see me. Well, I'm glad they at least made him wait. The trouble with this argument was that Rush hadn't the faintest idea of what socialism is. I said there were no truly socialist countries, but Neil thought otherwise. Neil said, well, most of Europe is, isn't it? Canada is. And he goes, what? A few nationalized industries? That's at best state capitalism. Neil goes, state capitalism? What's that? He said, instead of a multinational as a boss, you have the government. And Neil goes, you have the government that owns airlines that lose money, school systems that lose money, build roads that lose money, hotels that lose money. And he said, you don't think free medicine is a good idea? And again, obviously not. Where are all the good British doctors right now? Well, the good ones are still here. Neil said, oh yeah, you think so? Where are all the British scientists? Probably in the States. Now, so why is Britain in the state it's in if it's not socialism? What is it? Why is British technology 25 years behind America? If free enterprise had come in after the war, this country would be fine. He goes, I won't bore you with our discussion about the war and American capitalism, but it turned out that Neil didn't even think America was capitalist. Neil said, it doesn't exist anywhere, even in America. It's a mixed economy now. It's not true laissez-faire capitalism. He goes back to national health care, and Neil said, at whose expense? And he said, the state's expense. And he said, Neil goes, the state? Well, where does the state get this marvelous magic money? And Barry says, tax. And Neil goes, exactly. Well, maybe I don't want to pay tax. Let's see. He goes, and they were talking about art under socialist states and how it cripples art and entertainment. And Barry goes, to me, this is getting too absurd to answer because the whole extreme right position is so illogical and irrational. The thing is, these guys are advocating this stuff on stage and on record, and no one even questions it. No one is on their case. All the classic hallmarks of the right wing are there. The pseudo-religious language. Compare their lyrics to Ayn Rand's quote at the head of this article, which extends right down to calling their touring crew road masters instead of road managers. The use of a quasi-mystical symbol, the naked man confronting the red star of socialism. He said, at least I suppose that's what it's supposed to be. It's all there. Then, he says, they are actually very nice guys. They don't sit there in jackboots pulling the wings off flies. They are polite, charming even, naive, roaming the concert circuits, preaching what to me seems like proto-fascism, like a leper without a bell. Neil says that the example that we're trying to create, we live by. We don't want to get on stage and be like John Lennon, for instance, and ram the message down to people's throats. Again, it comes down to choice. See, they don't want people to have choice. But the choice is, those things are in our lyrics. And if people feel like paying attention to our lyrics and trying to get something out of it, it's there for them. If they don't, fine. And well, we've got other things to offer as well. He said, just before my tape ran out, Neil scoffed at the idea of a welfare state could provide the things needed to make people free. For some people, freedom is freedom from worrying about medical care, for instance. But these things cannot appear magically, you know. This is the overlooked factor. For me, if I'm going to be free, I have to be free from worrying about medicine, free from worrying about a job, free from worrying about food, and free from worrying about a home. You provide that to me, that's what a government has to provide me to make me free. Obviously, that's ridiculous. That's ludicrous. And then Barry ends up by saying, funny, I would have thought that it was something to work towards as a human right in the technological age. Rush would like to return to the survival of the fittest jungle law, where the fittest is, of course, the one with the most money. Wrapping things up, he says, make sure that the next time you see them with your eyes open and know what you see. I, for one, don't like it. Rush was known as the thinking man's band for a reason. They made you think about things you might not ordinarily think about. Rush were free thinkers in a world that didn't want you thinking outside the box. And they attracted free thinkers to their music. Free thinkers are confident, logical, and intelligent. They give birth to their own ideas and resist the dominating mantras of the simple-minded. Having a mind that is free and the courage to express it will often mean free thinkers have only a few close friends who are equally interesting and intelligent. I guess Barry Miles didn't want Rush thinking freely without a bell. This article was published and syndicated all over the world, and media personalities from around the world got the message. Rush is a far-right fascist Nazi band that should be ignored, ridiculed, impugned, and suppressed as much as possible. In other words, Rush had been canceled. The only reason Rush survived the 70s and beyond is because we, the original Rush men, free thinkers from around the world, would not let them die. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Original Rushman Show. But before you go, please like, subscribe, and make a comment. Thanks for watching.